Good evening. It is lovely to welcome you to our second community conversation of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. I'm the Reverend Mary Margaret Earle, and I'm the Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry in Roxbury.
And hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Monique Marshall-Veal, and I'm the Director of Special Projects at the Urban Ministry.
For those of you who don't know us, the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry is a 190-year-old nonprofit, and we've operated all those years in Boston. And in 1976, we inherited the building and the campus known as First Church in Roxbury. And since then, we've run programs out of that space. And in 2020, we do three basic things. We operate services and programs for survivors of domestic violence. We have after-school programming for high school students. And we are transforming our historic church building, Boston's oldest surviving wood frame church, into a true meeting house, a place to serve the neighborhood of Roxbury. In normal times, pre-pandemic times, we would offer all kinds of arts and humanities offerings in our meeting house: concerts, lectures, panel discussions, events like the one that you're going to have a view of this evening, our community conversation. Because we couldn't have this in our meeting house, we decided to try to offer these virtually. And we can't be together in person, but we are gathering this way to keep the conversation going. Monique, you're muted.
Sorry about that, everyone. And just to talk a little bit about the foundations of our community conversations, they were built upon the interest and the commitment the Urban Ministry has had to the community of Roxbury. And the foundation of our community conversations is to highlight the history of Roxbury and the experiences of our Black and Indigenous people of color in our community. Please join us next month for a conversation on mental health with Toy Burton. We welcome you back then. Thank
you, Monique. So this evening, we're going to begin with a commercial that we made that highlights a Black-owned business in Nubian Square. We're really proud that we're going to be highlighting a wonderful restaurant, Suya Joint, and every community conversation will feature a commercial that we've made highlighting such a business. And then we'll also share a sponsorship. The Urban Ministry has approximately 50 UU member congregations, and each of our community conversations will be sponsored by one of our member congregations. And then after our commitment minute from our congregations, we'll get to the main event. This evening, we are just so proud and honored to welcome Imari Jeffries, the new director of King Boston, who is going to be with us to talk about closing the racial wealth gap in Boston. And now we are so delighted to share a commercial about Suya Joint, where I've eaten a number of times, which is so delicious, and you will be able to see that now.
Hi, my name is Tamika, and welcome to Suya Joint. Our location here in Boston is 185 Dudley Street in Roxbury, across the street from Hibernian Hall. You can also catch our food truck around the city on our social media. Our online experience is pretty easy. You can actually go on suyajointrestaurant.com, and you have a choice between Boston and Providence. One of our favorite meals here is a combo, which is jollof rice, choice of meat, and plantains, sweet plantains. And that actually was featured on Phantom Gourmet just recently. He tried it with the fufu, and a fufu is a finger food. Normally we eat crackers. This is our cracker. The fufu is like the cracker. Well, you dip it in a soup When you mention a soup for Nigeria, it actually can be of a thicker consistency, more like a stew. Our mission statement is literally to share Africa with the world. We have at least 3 different countries, or 4 even sometimes, coming together. So we try to involve ourselves in the community in any way, shape, or form that we can. If they come to approach us with an idea, we are totally there for them. Most recently, we were partnering with World Central Kitchen, and at World Central Kitchen, we provided the meals and they actually paid for the meals. So the voters and volunteers at the West Roxbury site was able to actually have a hot meal as they went to voting or left from the voting. We do offer gift certificates. You can buy that here or online at suyajointrestaurant.com. And we are also working on our Thanksgiving specials, which you should see this week. We are actually open from Tuesday through Saturday, and our hours have changed for brunch on Sunday mornings from 11 to 2, and then for evening service from 5 till 9 p.m.
That looks so delicious. The food is wonderful.
It certainly did. And at this time, we will have our commitment minute by the Unitarian Universalist Society of Wellesley Hills.
Good evening, everyone. I am the Reverend Dr. Kelly Murphy Mason, Senior Minister of the Unitarian Universalist Society of Wellesley Hills. And on behalf of our 3 UU Urban Ministry delegates, our board and our Social Action Council, and our entire membership, I want to say how very pleased we are to be sponsoring this crucial community conversation tonight. Closing the wealth gap in Boston is an important action that we can take for greater racial justice. And here at UU Wellesley Hills, we have committed ourselves to the necessary ongoing work of anti-racism. Since 2017, we have held a monthly vigil on our church grounds affirming that Black Lives Matter, indeed that they always have and they always will. Please join us in that public witness sometime if you can. We are so proud to be one of the longtime member congregations of the UU Urban Ministry as it continues its outreach through this pandemic and deepens and expands its work in Roxbury, where it helps to marshal resources in support of Black-owned businesses. Our presenter tonight, Imari Jeffries, in his role as Executive Director for King Boston, is now overseeing the opening of the King Center for Economic Justice. We welcome his unique insights on what can be done to create a more equitable city and ultimately a more just world. Thank you all for tuning in and confronting some of the most urgent issues facing America today. It matters a great deal that we face them together. These are days that call for our bravest selves, and they always do best in good company. The UU Urban Ministry gives us plenty of good company, and for that, in this month of Thanksgiving, we are tremendously grateful. What wonderful bounty we have to share with one another. Enjoy this evening's program.
Thank you so much to the Unitarian Universalist Society of Wellesley Hills. We thank you so much for your commitment to racial justice work. And we can't do the work that we do at Urban Ministry without the support of our many congregations who support the work that we do, not only on our campus in Roxbury, but in their congregations, in their home congregations. So thank you again for your work.
And now it's my pleasure to welcome Imari Jeffries, the main event for tonight's community conversation.
Thank you. So at this time, would we like to just introduce him and welcome him, Mary Margaret?
Absolutely.
Great.
So In June of this year, Imari Jeffries was named Executive Director of King Boston. He brings a wealth of experience from the nonprofit management, community activism, education reform, and social justice sectors. And he served on executive roles at Parenting Journey, Jumpstart, Boston Rising, and Friends of the Children. He serves as a trustee of the UMass system, as well as on the boards of USES, Providers Council, and Governor Baker's Black Advisory Commission. He most recently was named the executive director he was most recently served as the executive director of Parenting Journey. Previously, he served as CEO of the Italian Home for Children, a nonprofit organization that provides a comprehensive network of services to children, families, and adults with emotional, behavioral, and educational special needs. He's also served as CEO of Jumpstart for Young Children, Inc., as interim CEO of Boston Rising, as executive director of Friends of the Children Boston. He has extensive professional experience in public, national, and nonprofit service.
And Imari Jeffries currently serves on the Mass Board of Registration of Social Workers and on the Appalachian Mountain Club. He has served on the boards of Jumpstart and the African American Federation of Greater Boston, Save the Harbor, Save the Bay, the Elizabeth Peabody House, the Massachusetts Mentoring Partnership, the Edward Brooke Charter School, and Third Sector New England. Imari's is a 3-time graduate of UMass Boston and is currently pursuing his PhD through UMass Boston Higher Education Program. He earned his BA in 1997 and his Master's in Education in 1999, and his MA in 2003 from the University of Mass Boston campus. And in addition, Imari is a veteran and served from 1991 to 1996 during the First Gulf War. He is the recipient of the AD Club Rozoff Champion of Change Award. Sorry about that. Again, it is an honor to have him with us tonight. Please welcome Imari Jeffries.
Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Reverend Earl, Mary Margaret. Hi, Monique. I'm so glad to be here. And I'm hungry after seeing the Suya joint commercial.
Me too.
So when you said main event, I was thinking if I had enough time after this to head over to Suya to pick something up.
And we hope everyone will go to Suya to pick something up, for sure. So, Imari, can you tell us, you have such a broad background with so much expertise. What was it that drew you to this particular new role at King Boston?
First of all, I want to thank you both for having me here this evening and really being invited, by all the congregations that make this happen. And so it feels an honor to speak with you all today and to be the second speaker, and coming after Representative Byron Rushing is no small order. So I'm going to do my best. And I saw a couple of my friends. I saw my friend Raul and my friend Pam in the participants audience. So I'm going to try not to embarrass them and let them down either. I think when the opportunity presented itself, sometimes I joke around, you hear my bio and folks either say, Imari's had a lot of opportunities or Imari can't keep a job. So it might be somewhere in the middle. And, when I think about the work of our community, I think you and I, the three of us know that doing the work in the helping sector is complex, right? And so, we can't think that we're going to change or impact the lives of folks in education only, or in the environment or outdoors only, or in higher education or early education. And so I feel like my trajectory in my day job in volunteer service has been marbleized. And so I've tried to understand barriers to the success of BIPOC communities through work or through volunteer service. And when the opportunity for King Boston was emerging a few years ago with a memorial involved to the King Center, I thought it was a good opportunity for me to combine many of my experiences and my passion for convening and organizing into one organization. And so Marie St. Fleur, when she was transitioning out, really a few months before she was transitioning out as executive director, recruited me on to be, her and Kate Getch at TBF recruited me on to be the next leader of King Boston. And I'm so honored to follow in their footsteps and be a part of this organization.
Thank you, Imari. For the folks who are joining us, can you say a little bit about the monument itself, which is going to be in the Boston Common, and why does it matter that it's located there? There are many places it could be. Why does it matter that it's going to be on the Boston Common?
Yeah, and I think that's an important question, because when the founders in 2017 and before imagined a model of a memorial to commemorate the Kings, both Dr. King and Mrs. King's time in Boston, the location was important. And I think what it ultimately came down to, I think it was an important statement to say, particularly in this time now more than ever, to have a memorial and a plaza that commemorates Black leaders in one of our country's oldest parks was an important statement for Boston to make. And so that was incredibly important. And we wanted the memorial to be one of the crown jewels in our city's center, in our city center. And I'll talk about it a little later. The King Center for Economic Justice will be in Roxbury and ideally in Nubian Square. And so that location will be in our city's geographic center. And so having the embrace in our city's industry center and having the King Center in our city's geographic center, the heart of Black Boston, was an important statement for some of the founders and organizers of King Boston, is that we wanted to center ourselves in places that were centered, both the geographic, the economic, and the park.
And I think you're going to talk a little bit and show some images in a little bit of the sculpture itself. But I wonder if you could just hint for us talk a little bit about how that locating that sculpture, the work to put that sculpture and that monument there, can be a catalyst for something bigger than just a sculpture.
Yeah, and when I think in the current discourse around monuments and memorials around the country, we know that monuments are political. And that most of the Confederate monuments funded by the Daughters of the American Confederacy were erected 50 years after the Civil War, the majority of them happening in the 1920s. And so there's an importance of having memorials be living. And so when you go to the center of Richmond and you see the statue of Robert E. Lee in Monument Row, there's a statement that says, if you are a person of color, if you're Black, if you're different, you're not welcomed here. And so there was, on the one hand, it was about under the guises of honoring Confederate leaders, it was also a statement of not being welcomed in power. And so when we thought about putting the memorial in Boston Common, we thought, well, what does that mean for our city? How could we represent that meaning? And Boston, you've probably heard in some surveys, we are the 4th most unwelcoming place, or we're the 9th most racist place. And there's all kind of things that color Boston in a bad way. And so as we think about emerging post-COVID, as we think about Boston emerging in the heels of the murder of George Floyd, as we think about Boston emerging after this economic pandemic, what values does the King Memorial represent for our city? And so Embrace Ideas, which is the third part of our holy trinity of programs, represents the ideals of spatial justice, represents the ideas of truth, reconciliation, welcome, and love. And so we thought that those were important values that we not only state with the monument, but also state through active programming.
Thank you. Thank you, Imari.
Thank you. Imari, in speaking about, Black Boston, our leaders, and our entrepreneurs in thinking about the state of our country right now and how it's impacting a lot of Black businesses and businesses overall. Can you talk a little bit about the King Center's mission for economic justice and share a little bit about that with us tonight?
And so, and I think, economic justice, economics, and wealth is one of the ways in which racial equity is represented. It is one of a myriad of metrics that shows when a city, when a region, when a community is demonstrating racial equity and when a community is not. And so in 1965, when King returned to Boston and this march, the 1965 Freedom March occurred, organized by Boston activists and faith-based and community leaders, they marched for 4 reasons. Those reasons were poverty, housing, racial equity, and education. And so those were the pathways in 1965 that ultimately lead to economic justice. And so, Imari, what does that mean, right? So poverty is a symptom of economic justice not working. Mm-hmm. Racial equity is a barrier to economic justice for BIPOC communities. Housing is both a spatial justice issue, right? And so in the 60s and 50s and 70s, we saw redlining in Boston and in other communities. And so housing is one way in which many families accumulate and pass down wealth from one generation to the other. It also is a way that your family is stabilized, right? It's the way that your family feels safe, right? And without safety and without the opportunity to control your living expenses through home ownership, you're always in flux. So housing was an important issue then. And then the last thing that they marched for, the last issue that they marched for in 1965 was education. And so education as a tool and a means for folks to change their economic conditions. And so when we think about those issues today, they are still problematic in Boston. And so the King Center wants to examine and interrogate those 4 themes in a different way. We want to view them systemically. We want to utilize Boston's rich resource ecosystem. This is the 4th largest college town. And so we have a lot of research institutes in Boston. We want to leverage that existing research. We want to engage community with community organizing and base building to get them engaged into these discourses around wealth building, around housing, K-16 education, around racial equity. And so that's many of that programming, the research, the organizing, the policy will originate from the King Center. Mm-hmm. And so, and that's how we think about economic justice pragmatically through those existing systems. We also think about them through, and maybe I'm jumping ahead to a next question, but we also think about them through embrace ideas. And so again, a lot of times in anti-racist discourse, we talk about policy or training or data, but we don't talk about well-being and joy, and we don't talk about reconciliation. And so you and I know that well-being and joy is an essential part of being human. And so if we don't really talk about the spiritual side of eliminating racism, and we only focus on this pragmatic, tactical side of eliminating racism through the King Center, I don't think we're going to disrupt any canons of racism. I think we will just think of new ways in which to do old things, and I think we're attempting to do something different this time.
I love that. As a minister, I'm just going to say I love that framing. So thank you. Yeah, I do think we need to go deep. We can't look at the outside. We have to go deep in ourselves.
That's right, and I think many times, well, we forget or don't forget. Dr. King came from a faith-based tradition, and so movements and humans and people have to be rooted in a sense of spirituality in whatever way spirituality manifests itself. And so to ignore that part of who we are and only focus on pragmatic change, I think we're going to miss something. We're not going to connect with everyone. And I think we're attempting to do both. And again, we're attempting to do both through partnering with organization and convening, and not by creating another multi-service center in Boston, because the city certainly doesn't need that.
Amen. One of my colleagues, Reverend Mariama White Hammond, talks a lot about that it's not just about, those external things. It's really about transforming ourselves and transforming this world. And I can just hear that resonance in what you're saying.
I was a few minutes late to our pre-call. I was on a Zoom with Mariama, so we were just so maybe it was channeling through my pores, because we got the Reverend White Hammond vibes.
I try to channel her also, so yeah, both of us. So, sorry, Monique. Sorry.
No. You're absolutely right. As you were talking, Imari, I was thinking how important the Black church was in, the movement for people of color. It was their go-to. It was where they found their strength. It was where they started to really believe in transformation and understanding why this work is so important, and how not only does it impact those that are in the trenches, but it's for the many generations to come. So thank you for sharing that. I also understand that you have some slides that you wanted to share with us to highlight some of the information that you've already talked about, but to certainly dig a little bit deeper and to share that with us. So
I do, and it might help frame the conversation, and I think in regards to this faith-based perspective, 12 Baptist, which is right down the street from where we are, if we were in person, it was King's home church, and that's where Dr. and Mrs. King met when they were students in Boston. And so, I think it's important. And 12 Baptist has an inspiring new pastor-elect, Willie Bodrick, who's starting in the new year. And so I'm so excited about his leadership and all the things that we'll do together, both faith-based and community-based organizations. So I'm going to show my slide, and forgive me if it doesn't turn out right. And so we at King Boston, when we present our deck, we always start with a land acknowledgement, and I think particularly in this time when we are doubling down on equity, when we are doubling down on an anti-racist perspective, it's important to raise up our Indigenous allies. And we are, this is the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower arriving at Plymouth Rock, and we're a couple days before Turkey Day, and so there's a lot of history related to this Thursday and our Native American friends, and so it's important to raise up Nipmuc and Wampanoag and Massachusetts people, and we are all visitors on their land, and so we are building the embrace as visitors in the common. And so this is a great picture of Dr. and Mrs. King when they were young. And that looks like BU, Commonwealth Avenue. And so they both met as students in the 50s. Dr. King went to BU, Mrs. King went to New England Conservatory. And so, Boston is the 4th largest college town, but we're the 9th largest city in size. And so there are so many folks that come to Boston to go to school that leave. And so one question that was posed to me, imagine if the Kings, like many Boston college students, had decided to stay in Boston. What would the state of Boston's civil rights, what would the state of Boston's equity, anti-racist movement be today if they had decided to stay? And so when we think about the role of students in our city, because we are the 4th largest town, 375,000 students come through the Commonwealth every year, it's important to think through how do we ensure that we are both welcoming for folks who live here and students. And so when King Boston thinks about the 1965 return, we understand that it didn't happen in a vacuum. And so 1963 to 67 was an important period in Boston's civil rights history. 65 was when Dr. and Mrs. King returned for the 1965 Freedom March. 63 through 67 was a period of a lot of activities, and you guys remember in 1974 was the school busing case, and so this period in time paved the ground for a lot of the things that happened in the 70s. And so when we think about those Boston leaders, we think about Reverend Haynes, who we know was the pastor of 12 Baptists, as well as a state legislator, an icon in our city. And so we can't think about what it means for Dr. King to be a part of Boston history without Dr. Haynes. We can't think about the Kings in Boston's history without thinking about Ruth Batson, who was chairperson of the NAACP Education Committee, among many other things. She's an icon in our city. We can't think about Dr. King and the movement without thinking about Reverend REEB, who died in '65 while marching in Selma. And so he was one of the great martyr leaders of the movement, a Unitarian minister from Boston. So we can't think about this time without thinking about Reverend REEB. Or Reverend Wood. Reverend Wood was one of the core organizers, and I won't read through some of the incredible things that Reverend Wood accomplished while he was in town, but he was an iconic figure in the 60s and 70s, and here in Boston was important and instrumental for Dr. King's return in '65. We can't neglect to mention the Snowdens, who were icons in the 50s, and Freedom House, which is an important institution in Roxbury and Dorchester, laid the ground for Dr. King's return, and they are heroes and icons in this city and across the country. We can't forget Reverends BREEDEN and Carter, who met while they were students in Dartmouth, who were instrumental in the 1963 Stay Up for Freedom campaign, where they urged a stop out to protest the injustices in Boston Public School. We can't forget Margaret Mosley, who was one of the leaders who in '65 also traveled down to Selma with other women to work on voting. And so during this time where we're thinking about voting, it's important to raise up Margaret Mosley. Sarah Ann Shaw, I skipped through that because the screen was messed up, but Sarah Ann Shaw was another iconic leader that we want to raise up. And then lastly, these two little known leaders in our town, Mel King and HUBIE Jones, who in 1965, when they were young, I think HUBIE told me the story. He had just was a few years out of graduate school, organized the general boycott in 1963 to protest a combination of housing, police brutality, and segregation in public schools. And so these icons paved the way for Dr. King through '65, through '67, both the work that King's March in '65 did for our city and the work afterwards. And so this quote strikes me because now more than ever it seems to resonate. And so maybe Dr. and Mrs. King were in a time machine, and he wrote these in 2020 and came back and said them in the '60s and '50s. It would be irresponsible for me to deny the crippling poverty. Let me move this screen. Sorry about that. Crippling poverty and injustice that exists in some sections of this community. The vision of New Boston must extend into the heart of Roxbury. Boston must be the testing ground for this ideal of freedom. And so, Dr. King said this in '65 as a part of his March speech, and it, for me, it resonated me. And if there was ever a Dr. King speech that sold a job on someone, it was definitely this. And so I feel like Boston has the opportunity of being a big little city to be that testing ground for what a city rooted in anti-racism and equity could be. And so when we think about the original routes, and again, I mentioned this earlier, we think about Nubian Square to the Common and the Common to Nubian Square. That's 2.7 miles, the 1965 Freedom Corridor. And so we ground ourselves in these two places and the spaces in between, not because we are a place-based organization, but we understand what it means to be in our city's center and the geographic center of a city when we do our work. And so this was one of the archives, archival literature from the march, and you see it's small to see, but there were 4 reasons why Dr. King and the other leaders marched during 1965. This was one of the images from the march. The picture to the right seems like, I think that's Tremont Street. This is Dr. King at the Parkman Bandstand, and you see that it's quite a crowd back then. And so these were the 4 themes. Poverty, we've changed it to wealth, and I think if we keep using poverty language, we're orienting ourselves in poverty language. And what we really want to talk about is wealth and prosperity for folks. Housing was problematic in 65. Again, it's still one of the pieces of our work. Racial equity in public education. So when we talk about public education, we talk about K-16, and we also talk about post-secondary opportunities for work. And so it might be a trade, it might be a skill opportunity, but public education is extended far beyond K-12 education as it was back then. And so the Embrace, and if some of you remember, there was a national contest, and the national contest asked for renditions of what it might be to honor the Kings in Boston. And this picture was the inspiration for Hank Willis Thomas, who is a New York-based, nationally known artist, and his rendition was the rendition chosen for the Embrace. And so we're so excited. I got to be on a panel with Hank a couple of weeks ago and talked to him the other day. I mean, he's such an amazing guy. And I think Boston is having somewhat of a renaissance with Black sculpturists. And I'm having a brain freeze. Someone on the line could probably help me. The ICA just commissioned the other world-renowned sculpturist in an exhibit in 2023. So Boston's seeing a renaissance of Black art. So it's quite an exciting time for us. And so this is the rendition of the Embrace. And if you could imagine that these 2 boxes, the box right directly behind the Embrace is the Parkman Bandstand. The weaving pattern, in between the weaving pattern, there will be bronze plaques, and those plaques will represent the names of Boston civil rights icons. And so I feel like we're getting a 2-for-1 here. We started off trying to honor Dr. and Mrs. King, and now we ended up with two incredible memorials, one to Dr. and Mrs. King through the Embrace Memorial, and one is 1965 Plaza to honor the civil rights icons that I just showed on the deck. And then this is a rendition, an artist rendition of what a King Center might look like in Boston. And so, we're excited about pursuing a Nubian Square home for the King Center, a place where research and organizing and convening and gathering can occur. And then the last piece that I'll talk about is the Embrace ideas. And so when we think about the memorial, we understand that public places are key to vibrancy and resilience. We understand that structural infrastructure is at risk, and we understand that places must be self-determined. And so the Embrace ideas ended up through a series of conversations. Initially, it started out as a way to just think about how we unveil the Embrace in 2022. And it morphed into a full-fledged program of King Boston, where we're using arts, teach-ins, music, panels, film, journalists, etc., to engage in well-being, love, joy, truth, reconciliation, discourse. And again, this is the heart work, this is the spiritual work, which is different from the very pragmatic policy, research, grassroots organizing that will be the primary work of the King Center. Embrace ideas will live in the King Center, but in 2021, you'll see a series of events occur virtually to keep us safe, and culminating with a week-long festival the week in October of 2022, where we unveil the Embrace. And so we're excited about this holy trinity of work, and all in partnership with other organizations. And when we're imagining the Embrace Ideas Festival, the first one in 2022, there's about 17 other organizations that have signed up to be a part of the Embrace. And so this week won't be a week-long King Boston event. It will be events also held by other organizations under the same banner, with the ideas that our vending dollars, our sponsorship dollars will go to support Black, Indigenous, and POC businesses. And so if those organizations, and when we convene and those organizations use their vending dollars for food, we hope to use institutions like Suya Joint for all the catering to really provide opportunities to stand up Black, Indigenous, and POC businesses that are struggling, like many businesses, during the pandemic. And so I'm going to stop screen sharing and just open it up and just get your reactions. And
Exciting stuff.
Thank you.
And the Urban Ministry is looking forward to being part of the Embrace 2022. So.
Excellent.
I'm so excited to have you as one of the partners on it. It's going to be a great event, and I think we're going to be ready in 2022 to get together and embrace each other. And so
Yeah, I hope even sooner. Yeah.
Hopefully sooner.
Yeah.
Yes.
And just before Monique asks another question, a couple of Mary Blanchette and also Pam Hurd wondered, is the sculptor you're thinking of Simone Lee?
Yes, my friends. Yes. It's super exciting. I had a brain. Thank you both. I had a brain freeze. I could not think of Miss Lee.
Yes. And there's a note also that just got added. The ICA will host the show beginning in January 2023.
Yes. So it's an incredible renaissance for Black sculpturists in Boston, because Miss Lee is world renowned. She's been doing this for years, and so having Hank Willis Thomas in the Common and Miss Lee at the ICA and having her represent Boston in Venice Biennale in 2022 is such an incredible honor.
Great. Thank you. Wow. I'm very excited about the work that is coming to the community of Roxbury, Nubian Square. It is going to be a highlight for many of us, and I too look forward to it as being an employee of the Urban Ministry, but just being a partner in the work. So thank you for that. And just listening to you talk about the historical perspective and how things resonate even today with Dr. King. And as I think about, again, the state of the country we are in now and the impact that it's had on Black businesses, and again, me reflecting, thinking about my growing up in the city of Boston, there consistently is a racial wealth gap. And my question is, how can the King Center help with that? What is it that you envision them being able to do to kind of help address that issue of that persistent gap in wealth for people of color?
I think one thing that this 2020 has brought front and center, and I think many of us can agree, I think I've never heard a president accept the election and use the words systemic racism in their acceptance speech. And so we're in a different time, and you hear that so often. We're just in a different time. And I think when Dr. King and Boston leaders were talking about those issues as pathways to economic justice, we didn't know or we couldn't say or activate in a way that we can now. And I think when the King Center thinks about economic justice, we are not thinking about programming or workforce development or scholarships for BIPOC young people to go to college. We're thinking about how can we dismantle systems. How can the King Center exist like a cancer research center? Because racism is a cancer, and racism as it impacts folks through economics has to be eliminated like one would find a cure for COVID. And so we don't know what it looks like to eliminate racism both in our hearts and through our laws. And so our attempt through ideas and the King Center is to try to attack them both, and not creating or recreating things from scratch, because Boston's such a resource-rich place. There's so many practitioners and leaders that are already doing the work. I think we want to function as a community note taker and a convener for existing work that feels important to us. And so addressing these issues systemically is one way the King Center Embrace Ideas is thinking through how we eliminate racism. And I think our approach is to unapologetically acknowledge that racism exists, so a very critical race theory approach, and to understand that all of us, because we've lived in a racist society, have been socialized into ways that shape our behaviors, attitudes, being. And so we want to think through how we dismantle and disrupt all of our canons that continue to socialize and re-socialize us into racist practices. And so disrupting those canons require us to create new canons, and so require us to create new behaviors. And so it could have easily been, one thing for King Boston to say, hey, we're unveiling a statue, let's have a big party for King Boston. There's another thing for us to say, how can this be a catalytic moment for a myriad of organizations, businesses, individuals? And so this approach of collaboration and convening is one of the ways that we also want to dismantle racism, also one of the ways that we want to raise up our justice work.
Thank you, Imari. There's a follow-up question in the chat. This is an action-oriented audience, so they want to know, how can individuals help close the racial wealth gap besides patronizing businesses of color and restaurants?
And Mary Margaret, you and I just had this conversation the other day. I think, Monique, we also had this, and I hate, at the expense of sounding cliche, where people say, you got to do your own work, right? And so I guess my answer is, we got to do our own work. A lot of times the way that racism works, and I think this is a great question. It has us thinking that the problem is something that we have to do to other people or other things. It almost, racism almost doesn't allow our individual personal work to count as work. And so that doesn't count. Like, if you're not doing something, we're not frequenting, POC businesses, we're not doing real work. But the self-work is important work. And so I think one of the ways that we can work to eliminate the racial gap is to do our own education through some of our faith-based organizations, some of the work that King Boston is doing. There's an organization called Race Forward that I think is doing some pretty interesting work. The partnership is doing some interesting work. The YW is doing some pretty interesting work. I think there's got to be a way that we prepare ourselves to have our canons disrupted before we enter the work. And so a lot of times, you might hear this said in a way that sounds insulting, or, you stick it to you want to stick it to someone who's like, oh, well, I'm in this meeting and folks are that's people are crying, that's white fragility. White fragility is epistemological fractures, right? It is people getting their canons disrupted. And a lot of times when what we believe to be true is disruptive or disrupted, we get sad, we get emotional, we get angry. And so that's part of the work, right? That's not this, we got to get away from using dismissive language like, white fragility, and understand that is people reacting to their canons being fractured or disrupted. They are interrogating what it means when everything in all the ways they've been socialized might not be true. Everything that they believe to be true might not be true. What do you do? And it looks like people getting upset, emotional, et cetera. What's next? And so I think that work is important work. And sometimes you see us as POC and Black people getting angry or upset or not having time for it, right? because we're protecting ourselves, and that's part of our work too. And so, you know, what's the role of reconciliation and truth and empathy in anti-racist work? I think we're not at that stage yet, because we might be angry, or we might be sad, or we're just really sussing through this ourselves. But we'll get to a place where we can get to truth and reconciliation, and I think the readiness for that, for economic justice, for racial equity, because the pathway to economic justice is also through racial equity, right? It's also shaping the ways that we think about race, and that's important prerequisite to doing this work.
There's a lot there. There's a lot there that you just shared, Imari. You're giving me a lot to think about, and I'm sure you're giving everyone a lot to think about.
There's a lot. I see the questions coming in, and so
yeah, we're not quite there, but I do want to pop to one that came in. One of the questions, we're not actually not doing Q&A yet, but that's all right. People are eager to get in and do the Q&A, so we're going to let a few now. But one of our audience members asked, what role might reparations play in reducing wealth inequality?
I think they're an important role, and it is one of the pieces. It's one of the emerging bodies of work that's happening at the King Center. And so I'm on a anti-racist reparations committee centered in higher education. So thinking of the role of higher education as a vehicle for reparations. And so we know that Georgetown did a version of this. Brown did a version of higher education focused reparations. I think it's an important piece, and I think on the one hand, I think there is there's an asset-based benefit to reparations, and then there's the spiritual base, not just to the beneficiary of the reparations, but also around folks who don't feel reparations are right. And so, how do we interrogate our own feelings around justice? How do we feel about our own feelings around, hey, I wasn't around during this time. It looks like someone else is benefiting off something, like I never owned slaves, or I don't, I'm working hard. I'm barely paying my rent. And so there's work to do to even be in the spirit to see someone receive reparations and you not receive reparations. That's also a part of the work. And so it is not just the distribution of assets and the receiving of those assets, but it's all the work that it takes to be in a community where justice is being served, where you see someone getting an asset when you feel like you work hard and you're not receiving that asset, and be okay with it because you understand the context in which that asset is given. That's also reparations, and that's also the work. And so I think it's important. Reparations is an important part of this anti-racist discourse.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I see some good comments in someone. Ms. Gilmore said that Reverend Carter officiated her marriage and baptism of her daughter, which is incredible. It just shows the deep roots that our faith-based and community leaders have had in our city. And so I'm so excited, that we're honoring the Kings with this memorial, but that we have the opportunity to honor other icons that may not be as well known in this city, that are worthy of their histories being told, and that history being told front and center in our park. And so it's like when I see amazing stories or vignettes like that, it just makes me feel like we're on the right track of spatial justice, of creating spaces where recognition of folks who've done the work can exist alongside of other folks who are worthy of being honored.
We want to let folks ask more questions. We have a couple more too, but we did want to have a commercial break. Our community conversations are getting very sophisticated with our commercial breaks. And I'm going to say that supporting Suya Joint does both the supporting a Black-owned business, and it is self-care because the food is really yummy. So I think I'm going to invite us to watch the commercial again so that we can all write down the information to support Suya Joint, and then we're going to come back after that real quick break, and we're going to have space for the audience to ask more questions, and Monique and I have a couple more.
Hi, my name is Tamika, and welcome to Suya Joint. Our location here in Boston is 185 Dudley Street in Roxbury, across the street from Hibernian Hall. You can also catch our food truck around the city on our social media. Our online experience is pretty easy. You can actually go on suyajointrestaurant.com, and you have a choice between Boston and Providence. One of our favorite meals here is a combo, which is jollof rice, choice of meat, and plantains, sweet plantains. And that actually was featured on Phantom Gourmet just recently. He tried it with the fufu, and the fufu is a finger food. Normally we eat crackers. This is our cracker. the fufu is like the cracker. When you dip it in a soup, when you mention a soup for Nigeria, it actually can be of a thicker consistency, more like a stew. Our mission statement is literally to share Africa with the world. We have at least 3 different countries, or 4 even sometimes, coming together. So we try to involve ourselves in the community in any way, shape, or form that we can. If they come to approach us with an idea, we are totally there for them. Most recently, we were partnering with World Central Kitchen, and at World Central Kitchen we provided the meals, and they actually paid for the meals. So the voters and volunteers at the West Roxbury site was able to actually have a hot meal as they went to voting or left from the voting. We do offer gift certificates. You can buy that here or online at suyajointrestaurant.com. And we are also working on our Thanksgiving specials, which you should see this week. We are actually open from Tuesday through Saturday, and our hours have changed for brunch on Sunday mornings from 11 to 2, and then for evening service from 5 till 9 p.m.
All right. So we have the questions are coming in. So Monique, maybe you and I can go kind of take turns asking Imari some of these questions. I do want to let people know that there is an option of saying your question aloud. We'll try to incorporate some of those, but please keep in mind that this is being recorded. So if you do choose to speak, your comments will be recorded and shared. Do you want to take one first, Monique?
Sure. Yep. This question is coming from Holly Shepherd. Speaking of reconciliation, I think we should consider the risk of setbacks in racism with the increase in racial conflict as it manifested during the election. What really concerns me is the sense of going back in time. It to me is more than reparations, but advancement, so that the conditions we faced this past year are virtually eliminated. Would you like to respond to that comment?
You know, that's a great comment, and I agree. And I think we've seen, you know, if you think about even on the elections, 1/3 of Massachusetts voters voted Republican, right? They voted for the status quo. They voted for our president. In some of the politics and policies and actions that he represents. So there's a lot of work in this very, you know, blue Massachusetts that we need to do. And, you know, I think there was a talk by Reverend Barber, who you know is the NAACP president and pastor in Charlotte and lead of the New Poor People's Project. And he talked about this country really needing a third Reconstruction. And so, you know, I think we've been thinking about what does a third Reconstruction mean for Boston? You know, Boston was the heart of the abolitionist movement. And so what does it mean for us to double down in this moment in time, given the escalation of racial unrest and actions that we've seen? And so I think that is not just a real possibility. I think that's a reality of the work, and it feels like a stage of progression that we need to go through in order to get to the other side. And King's notion of radical love seems to fit during this time. We need to face this work bravely. We need to face this work in a spirit of love, but we still need to face this work. And so I think that feels like an important part in this moment in time.
We were proud, Imari, a few years ago, we actually welcomed Reverend Barber to the urban ministry, and he came and spoke with us there. So that was a proud moment for us. I want to share this question from Dave Harrington, who asks this. The effects of racism are evident in the city of Boston, but also in many of the suburbs that are prosperous and predominantly white. Does the King Center have plans for how to reach that population outside, but very near Boston?
I think we do think about, when we say Boston, and our name is King Boston. Massachusetts is such a small place, and we know that many of our suburbs are also impacted in different ways. I guess I'm going to say the news that I've seen happening in Everett, disparities that we've witnessed happening in Chelsea. I think there's role, and some of the predominantly white suburbs that don't have to or have the opportunity to avoid having conversations or engaging in anti-racist discourse because they're in cities or communities that are predominantly made up of one group. I think our goal is to expand some of the work beyond Boston city limits. I think we're in this planning growth stage, and so we are bringing on a deputy director who will lead up a lot of our programming. So stay tuned. The best is yet to come, and I think our plan is to have as big a footprint as we can.
And in terms of partnership, I would love for us to talk more about partnership with regard to that kind of question, because the urban ministry is in Roxbury and our member congregations are in those white suburbs, many of them. And so I think would be a great opportunity to connect on that and what that outreach looks like.
Thank you. So there's actually a comment and actually a question. So that relates. Imari, you talk a lot about economic justice, and you mentioned housing and spatial justice. Can you talk a little bit more about what that really means? And then there's a comment about spatial justice, and someone, Pam Hurd, mentions that she appreciates the concept of spatial justice. Perhaps reparations could include the housing crisis and the need to build more housing on transit lines to help folks get to work in the city. The city is expensive, but housing in suburban towns is important. So if you can talk a little bit about what that means, and then maybe make a comment to her statement there.
Yeah, I think if there's a Venn diagram of justice, spatial justice, economic justice, and among other things, probably surround that Venn diagram. And so when we think about the concept of spatial justice, on the one hand, there's the obvious monument that we're building. And so there hasn't been a significant memorial or monument in Boston Common, or Boston for that matter, for BIPOC communities. And so spatial justice represents the ability, on the one hand, the ability of us to be represented in space. And so that's an important aspect of spatial justice when we talk about it that way. The other times we talk about spatial justice is safety. So where can a woman, where can a BIPOC person feel safe? And so the majority of arrests and the type of things, murders that we've seen with George Floyd, happened while Black folks are driving. And so can a Black driver be safe in their car? Spatial justice. Can you be at a workplace where you don't feel afraid because you are the only woman in your workplace? Spatial justice. Can there be a workplace where you don't have to code switch in order to fit in, that you can bring and be your full self, spatial justice? When we talk about redlining and when we talk about housing, and I think Pam mentioned this, where can we be safe to live? And so we saw with redlining, banks and the powers that be created neighborhoods and created the type of disruption that prohibited people of color, Black folks, from living in a place. Spatial justice. They created the type of home mortgage programs that didn't allow folks that were not favorable to the homeowners. Spatial justice. And so spatial justice is about the ability to be represented in a space and the ability to be safe in a space. And so we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, you guys remember this, the tale of the two Coopers, right? There was Mr. Cooper, the bird watcher, and Mrs. Cooper, who called the police on him in Central Park, right? Two Coopers. And so can a Black man be safe bird watching, right? Spatial justice. But also let's talk about Mrs. Cooper, Miss Cooper. Mm-hmm. What is it about the moment where that was troubling, right? This other term that's come up, Karens, right? You know, barbecuing while Black, Karen's gonna call the police on you. Standing on the corner, you know, waiting for your delivery while Black, Karen's gonna call the police. So what is it about the idea of a Black body being positioned in joy that creates anxiety for folks? Mm-hmm. You know, Mr. Cooper bird watching, why did that create anxiety for Miss Cooper, right? So when we talk about spatial justice, we have to interrogate what it means to be safe in a space, and what it means to also be socialized to say when this person is in the space, it's no longer safe for me, right? It's no longer a safe space, and so it's a rich, meaningful conversation of who's safe, when is safety weaponized, why is safety or well-being of other folks bothersome or troublesome to me? Why does the safety or well-being create anxiety in me, right? These are spatial justice issues. You know, why are you know, I think the emergence of the Karen trope is another representation of spatial justice, and one of the reasons why this truth and reconciliation conversation has to be a part of anti-racist work in the city.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Imari. I do want to remind audience members that if you want to speak, you need to raise your hand, you know, virtually, and we can call on you, we can unmute you, and you could ask your question aloud. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask another question that's in the Q&A. What advice would you have for people of color who are currently in challenging socioeconomic realities in relation to the renaissance that is hoped for through King Boston's work? Sometimes it seems as though most benefits go to the strong, while many others get left behind, even during celebrated milestones in racial equality.
Ms. Bathia Israel, I think Ms. Israel asked the question. Bithia, you had to ask the hardest question. That's so complex, and I think it's such a hard question to ask, and I'm going to try to do it as best justice as I can. I think we're trying to, at least in the work that we're trying to do, is ground ourselves in engaging folks who are usually left behind in this conversation in the best that we can. We are attempting to put folks who are normally marginalized in the forefront, and we're trying to model that as best as we can. I mean, it's such a hard time right now when we have the luxury of being in Zoom and talking about this, and you know, I'm sure earlier in the week, congregations were helping pass out meals for families, and so we're balancing both our, you know, us being able to talk about this and plan through this, and then really directly working with folks. I think that's a hard conversation. I think we got to continue to raise up. Ayanna Pressley saying those closest to the pain should be closest to the power in making those decisions, and I think we're trying to center that in our work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see, we have another one in here. Oh, This one comes from Kathy Kaufman. Will you be working with Ibram X. Kendi in Boston in Boston in the 60s and paying attention? Those of us who were here in the city of Boston during the 60s and paying attention are well aware of Mel King and Hubie Jones. So are you going to be doing any work with the new leader of the Racial Justice Center at Boston University, Ibrahim X?
Yeah, our plan is to definitely engage the center and engage Dr. Kendi. I had an opportunity to moderate a small panel when he first arrived to town. He is on a whirlwind tour right now. I think his books are just, they feel like they're foundational reading for a lot of us in this work. And I really like how he's framed the racist, anti-racist discourse and really challenge us to push our language and evolve our language, particularly around power. And so our hopes is to work with the BU Center and Dr. Kendi, because I think the King Center as a research institution doesn't plan to do a lot of our own original research, but rather coalesce existing research that is already engaged and make it accessible to communities through partnerships with urban ministries, with our own base building work at the King Center. And so we don't plan to be an inaccessible place that does research. And Dr. Kendi has really created a lot of ideas and discourse and momentum around the work. And so I think now is the time to see how we can operationalize some of his work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So, Imari, I wanted to ask a question myself. In a meeting that you had convened with a number of organizational leaders, I remember you opened that meeting by talking about a study that had just happened that measured the support among people who are white for Black Lives Matter right after the killing of George Floyd and the protest as a result in the streets. And it was a percentage, I don't recall the exact percentage, but a very high number of people who are white reporting. They were very clear in the need to support the Black Lives Matter movement. And about 1 month later, that had fallen a number of points, which was very troubling to me. And I really, that was really troubling to me. And so one of the questions that I have for you is, how do we work together? How do organizations like the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry, like our member congregations, like King Boston, like other partners and allies, how do we keep this top of mind, top of heart, when there's going to be a lot of things that distract us? Right now, we're going through a presidential transition. There are some who might feel, well, things are going to get back to normal. There's a danger, I think, of being complacent. How do we keep focused on this?
Yeah, and I think that story was I saw it in two places. One of the places was in the Globe, and so it hit me the same way that it hit you. And one of the things I felt that the shelter-in-place order and the pandemic did for some folks, and understanding that a lot of us could not shelter in place and did not have safe spaces for us to be. But for a lot of folks, sheltering in place allowed folks to stop and reflect. And that stopping and reflecting gave us the opportunity to be inspired by the moment and understand what we needed to do to move forward. And I think it's important that institutions and leaders and congregation members and friends and leaders, I also mean, people who are leaders of their family or their friend group, continue recharging their batteries with other folks who think this is important. And so I think that is join a book club. People say, oh, well, what's a book club gonna, right? And so you hear both this back and forth around, oh, joining a book club, what's that supposed to do? I mean, it is important that we practice self-care, and that well-being is a part of our anti-racist practice. And so if joining a book club allows you to recharge your battery and get new information and new knowledge and interrogate your old knowledge and create new canons, then we should do that. Because I think if we don't create new practices if we utilize our old canons, the old ways that we were socialized to keep this momentum up, then the data that we saw where 2-3 months after George Floyd was murdered, people's enthusiasm, particularly white communities' enthusiasm, dies off, is because we're using old canons, old ways in which these spiritual practices, these values stay front and center. And I think, how do we build spaces that we can create new practices, new canons, new ways that we socialize ourselves, so that issues that impact us as a society don't fall in the wayside because it's now holiday season, or it's the Black Friday, or other issues. Is that almost that anti-racism doesn't become a new set of clothes that you put on based on the occasion, but it becomes the lens in which all of your clothes are examined. And so that's just a different approach. I think that I honestly don't know what that is. And I think it's an opportunity for us to all interrogate our canons and then recreate new knowledge so that we can share with each other these new practices.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a question from Linda F. I want to make sure that I give you an opportunity to ask your question. Linda? You can unmute yourself, I believe, at this point. Yes.
Yes. Hi. Linda F is actually Linda Freeman.
Hi, Linda.
Hi, Linda.
Hi. I'm sorry I came in late. Called rat racing.
You are fine. Welcome.
Good evening. Glad to be here, and thank you for allowing me to join in. My question is this: have you tried this question among community residents? Where were you on April 4th, 1968? And why do I ask that?
That was our second question, Linda.
Why? Because there's a lot of history among our residents where they were on April 4th, 1960. I am one of them. I was not here in Boston, but I was in Washington, D.C., where I grew up. I saw the ones who were looting as in running. I watched intermittently the District of Columbia going up in gray smoke, black smoke from 14th Street to 7th Street, Georgia Avenue, to 3rd and 5th Street, Northwest Rhode Island Avenue. I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not even supposed to be alive, because it was a matter of probably less than 20 minutes. I had to pull my mother and tell her to leave the laundry. Otherwise, we would have been beaten, raped, or murdered. And the reason why is I've also watched over the years how long it took for Washington, D.C. to rebuild. And Boston is going through the same rebuild as well. Here it is 52 years later, and we're still going through the same issues. I've been back to the District of Columbia a few times, and the areas that are in poverty, some of them still are. I nearly broke down in tears because I saw that the change had not come through for those who are disenfranchised.
Thank you, Linda.
But it comes because the racism is still there. It's still pervasive.
Racism is definitely still there. Thank you, Linda. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
And Linda, you know, I think you make a good point, and I think that's one of the things that we've been thinking about now. You know, thinking about Dr. King in 1968. You know, Dr. King was a young man. You know, he wasn't 40, and so most of Dr. King's work, you know, he was in his early 30s, early to mid 30s, late 20s. And so we think about the importance of young people doing the work these days. And so engaging, and maybe this is related to the earlier question, you know, I think youth voice is important. Young people, millennials, it's important in this work now. And so we imagine, we imagine an attempt to contemporize Dr. and Mrs. King's values for today. And I hope that some of our practices as an organization allows us to engage young people in all the ways that they need to be engaged, in the ways that, you know, that we show up in their spaces, and that feels important. And I think the other piece for us to, and I think this also might be related to one of the earlier questions around change. You know, Dr. King was not well liked in the 60s. He was persona non grata in many circles, and so his words and philosophies were not popular. And I think we have to continue to be bold in our convictions around what's right, and how we create economic justice and equity for everyone. And so I think we've been honest around Dr. King's legacy, around him not being liked, and not because we want to bring that up for the sake of bringing that up, but I think sometimes there's a role in being a truth teller, and a role in bringing folks who are not marginalized the forefront. And Dr. King was one of the best that did it. And so I think that is one of the values that we're trying to bring into King Boston and the King Center.
Thank you.
Thank you, Imari. You have shared so much information with us tonight, and we are truly grateful for the work that you're doing and will continue to do. In thinking about our audience who's present, there are folks from Roxbury, there's some folks from the UU churches and the suburbs, and Black and white and many people of color in our audience. And as I said before, this is an audience that is about action, and they want to know what it is that we can do to address this issue of economic injustice. And, you know, how do we do that and help transform Boston? And I think that will be our closing question for the night. So there's a lot behind that, but tell us what we can do to make a difference.
Well, I mean, this is not the end all be all, but I'd love if folks are interested in getting more information around how they might engage in the work that we do. Our website is kingboston.org, and my email is Imari, IMARI, @kingboston.org. And I'm pretty diligent about returning emails back. So Imari @kingboston.org or kingboston.org. And so I think if there's other questions, or folks want to continue the conversation around King Boston's view of this change, I definitely invite them to do the work. And I think there's some really great books out there. And so again, this idea of well-being and self-care as counting as work feels important. So there's some really good, interesting books. Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands is one that I would highly recommend to really understand how the body keeps score in the type of trauma, not just for BIPOC communities, but also for white folks. And so our bodies are traumatized to all of the toxic stress of racism. And so understanding it from a physiological point of view feels pretty important. And Dr. Kendi's book. And so those would be some other recommendations that I think I might invite folks to do, because sometimes it's scary stepping out into this journey of anti-racism. And I think there are safe places with books, literature, and TED Talks that are incredibly helpful. And so I thank you both and everyone who stayed with us and stayed with me for the last hour. It's been great. There's still time to go to Suya Joint. They close at 9. So if you're close, we can still stop in there. So thank you so much for having me this evening.
Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you for your insight, your wisdom, and also really your heart. The mix that you brought of kind of the facts and the knowledge and the history, but also that clear compassion for everyone. I really appreciate that. And I really want to thank you for being with us. And I look forward to partnering with you and working together for justice together. Thank you so much. Have a happy Turkey Day, everyone, in any way you can celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you.
And hope people will come to our next gathering, which is going to be on December 22nd. As Monique said, it's going to be Mental Health in the Holidays in the Black Community, presented by Toy Burton, founder of Dee Dee's Cry. So we hope you'll be here for next month for our next community conversation every month through June. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.